I am Yadvinder Malhi. I'm Professor of Ecosystem Science at Oxford University, and I'm an ecosystem ecologist. I study how ecosystems work, how they function, how they change. But my work at the moment particularly is focused on the restoration of ecosystems and how you go about doing that. And I'm director of the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery here at Oxford University, which looks in a multidisciplinary way at how we can restore nature at scale, both in the UK and around the world. To me, nature recovery is about improving the state of biodiversity, the state of nature everywhere around us. So there's a whole range of activities. At one end, it can be rewilding, letting forests grow back, letting extinct animals back. But it can also be more nature in our food systems, our farming systems. It can be more nature in our towns and cities and in our everyday lives. So it's all about increasing the amount of nature, not returning to some past state, but just increasing the amount of nature that we experience at all parts of our lives. What's the biggest obstacle to nature recovery? I think there are many. We've set ourselves a huge challenge. So both the United Nations and the Convention for Biological Diversity, but also national governments say we want to halt the decline of biodiversity, which has been occurring over the last decades and centuries, and start having an increase in biodiversity. But that requires so many things. At one level, it requires simply allowing nature to be restored, stopping the degradation and deforestation of nature. But at other levels, it involves rethinking our relationships with nature, putting nature at the center of our social thinking, our economic thinking, rather than being nature just being something on the side that we either use or don't use. Is something that's core as the sustaining matrix in which human society lives. So I think it involves some systematic rethinking of our nature, our relationship to nature, thinking about our economics, our political system, and do those systems respect and understand nature sufficiently as well. So our research on nature recovery is actually quite young. So it's actually, in some ways, we're still at a very early stage to see how that research leads through to practical nature recovery. But certainly the amount of research our broader team are doing at the moment ranges from everything from looking at whether it's better to plant trees or to let trees just grow back into abandoned fields, on ecological questions like that, through to social questions around how do you engage communities, bring communities together for nature recovery, to financial questions about how do you actually finance this. So I'd say it's a work in progress at the moment, but we're working with practitioners all around the world trying to do nature recovery to try and solve some of these questions around that. So local communities are essential, I think, for nature recovery. For it to work, ultimately, you've got to have the people in that area having some buy-in to what's going on. Now, the ideal model is where nature recovery is actually driven by those local communities, and where so some of the work we're doing in Oxfordshire is with clusters of farmers who've got together and are trying to restore the catchment of a river. Some of the work in Africa as well, we're working through local communities in Ghana who want to build a new nature tourism economy in their landscape. So the best model is where the communities are leading this, but where they're not leading it, we need to make sure that they're fully consulted so that they don't lose out from it as well, or as a whole. It's always individual winners and losers, you can't avoid that, but collectively they have a buy-in into that process. And there are ways of making sure they're fully consulted from the beginning rather than just added in at a late stage of the programme. The main objective of the centre is to tackle this big question. So everybody, governments and others are saying, and businesses are saying, we want to do nature recovery, but we have no experience of doing this at the scale that's being talked about now. And so what the centre is doing is really trying to look at those questions, and because it's quite a broad multidisciplinary centre, we can look at the bigger questions, as well as the specific ones about particular projects. We can look at these more systematic, economic, societal questions about what it takes to restore nature at scale. Very broadly, the centre works across 6 themes in nature recovery. The first theme is around ecology, and it looks at ecological questions about what stops or helps different forms of nature recovery. For example, tree planting versus natural regeneration versus rewilding. The second theme is around technology and scale, and to what extent can we use new technologies to monitor nature recovery? What do we actually mean by nature recovery in terms of measuring? What do we measure and how do we measure it? So there can be lots of conventional measures of species and other components, but can we use new technologies like remote sensing or acoustic sounding and sensing and eDNA sampling, environmental DNA, to try and assess the state of nature? And so how can they help us, coupled with new tools such as AI, to tackle these questions? The third theme is around society and governance. These questions of how do we govern nature recovery? How do we make sure it's fair and just so that nature recovery helps people and benefits people rather than people losing out at the expense of nature recovery? And how do we look at the values people have around nature? What do we mean about what is natural, what is beautiful? So looking at some of these cultural values. The fourth theme is around health. And this is a really innovative one, I think, around how does being exposed to nature, interacting with nature, affect human health? And we may already have a sense of how it affects mental health. People often feel better when they go for a walk in the park or a forest. But also there's lots of interesting evidence now coming out that it affects biomedical health as well. Your immune system is boosted by a walk in nature. Your risk of cardiac disease is decreased. And so we're working a lot with medics and others to try and understand how nature benefits people. And therefore, can we use that to improve the amount of nature in cities that can also benefit biodiversity as well? And the fifth theme is what I call integration, or sometimes entanglement. And so how does nature fit in with all the other things that human societies are doing in the world? How do we reconcile nature with producing enough food, with mitigating climate change, with urban development, and looking at all the trade-offs and interactions between or feeding the world and also having a vibrant living planet? And the final theme we have is around finance. How do we finance nature at scale? Whether through private finance, through risk or other components, looking at innovative ways of financing nature, while at the same time looking at the question of how do we avoid the commodification of nature, where nature just becomes another item on our financial balance sheet and loses perhaps some of its intrinsic importance and value. So tackling some of those questions around the right way to value and finance nature recovery. One of my long-term visions is simply to create a vibrant community thinking through these questions here at Oxford, and they're contributing to a wider national and international debate. And one of the amazing things we have in a university is lots of people coming in with different experiences, different perspectives. And I just want to create a culture of ideas and discussion and innovation around the whole space, independent of what those particular ideas are. Just get them out there and aired and discussed. But in the longer term, I would like to see this centre both making a real contribution to thinking through these ideas and these concepts at the national and international scale, and then having longevity as well. So the initial funding we have is for 10 years, but I would really like to find a way that once you've got this momentum going, that this centre continues and contributes to this for decades or for the centuries to come, because nature recovery is not something that's going to finish in 10 years' time. Hopefully we'll be on the right path by then, but we need decades and centuries of nature recovery beyond that. And I really hope the centre can play a major role in contributing and helping in this process. Advice to young researchers: hope and believe. And I think one thing about nature recovery that is quite tantalizing is that it's a very hopeful and tangible thing we can do. It's easy to fall into despair around climate change and geopolitics and feel powerless and helpless. But there's something very tangible about still caring about those big global issues, and for sure, but also there's something very tangible about improving the state of the natural world in your garden, in your college, in the streets around you as well. And so I am quite to me, hope is not about naive optimism. It's about clear-eyed, pragmatic, getting on and doing things. And I think there's so much that can be done in terms of nature recovery. And also there's so many opportunities. If you're a young person thinking about what to do with your life that's both rewarding and meaningful, what could be more rewarding and meaningful than restoring the health of the living planet and of people living on this planet?
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.